Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Arts and Ideas. We have a very special guest today, Gerry Jackson Kerdok. She is a nationally known calligrapher and art educator. She's won many awards around the country and is going to be showing us some of her work and how she does it, materials, and so forth later in the show. And actually demonstrating with her materials. So stay tuned. Gerry, I'm really delighted to be able to be here and see what you do and how you do it.
Thank you for inviting me.
How did you ever get started in calligraphy, I wonder?
Well, good question. I was an elementary school teacher and got through when I had my children, because it was before maternity leaves. Had always wanted to study art and started taking art classes at night, and a tiny part of a commercial art class was calligraphy, and I was hooked. And I've been studying it now for 35 years.
And where does one study calligraphy?
That is the problem. I started locally at a local high school and whatever, and soon found groups. In fact, there was a group in Worcester, the Worcester Calligraphers, with Sally Robertshaw, who taught at the museum.
Yes.
And
by the way, Gerry has been teaching calligraphy and other art courses at the Worcester Art Museum for 22 years, and that's how I got to know her.
And through Sally, she would bring in master calligraphers to Worcester. And then we formed a group called MathScribes and have brought in, and I've attended, because there is no college course in calligraphy where you could get an advanced degree.
Yes.
But I've had an opportunity through international conferences to study with master calligraphers from around the world.
So it's really people going after it on their own and teaching themselves and going to conferences and so forth.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So you weren't a painter originally, you were a teacher. And
yes, I was.
But now to do what you do, you really have to be a painter, a designer, graphic design, all of
Right. Well, I had taken that year of commercial art when I was home with my babies, and that was interesting. I was for a time art editor of the Stowe Villager newspaper, and got into specking type, but I was still learning my calligraphy all along.
Yes.
And then I've just picked up, classes in watercolor, colored pencil, everything you need to know. I love it when my students bring something in. I have a new student now who is a decorative painter, and that will be fun.
So you add a new vocabulary word to your list.
Yes, yes.
So you recently closed a big show in Falmouth. What was that?
Yes, it's at Highfield Hall, and it was a wonderful, The Art of Letters. And it was myself mostly with pen and ink letters, and a Rich Paulus, who was calligrapher to the White House. And then there was a fiber artist who used antique fibers with antique
So the
bits.
cool thing about calligraphy is, you think of it as being very specifically pen and ink, but what they're doing today is amazing. Maybe I could hold up one of these little books right now, just as a lovely visual thing to show the diversity of it. Now this has little woven papers in it, so the calligraphy is all there. It has stitchery, it has collage, it has a little bit of palm woven in there, ribbons. So it's really a sculpture, a book
that
form.
was an advanced class that I did last year at the museum with my advanced students, and every week we did a different kind of weaving. And that picture there, right here, was from my daughter's wedding. I took the flowers from her bouquet, this one right here, and wove them into the paper.
Oh, so you're weaving the stems of the flowers through the paper. How interesting.
And then that was the water blessing that I gave at the wedding. Oh. My wish for them and so forth. So, and that was their invitation and so forth. So, but the weaving was all over the same time.
I imagine a lot of your commissions are weddings and things like that.
Yeah, a lot of gifts. People have me do a piece, sometimes a reading. Sadly or happily, I do a lot of eulogies that people have spent a lot of time on.
Do you have a wedding example that you would like to show?
That's in my daughter's invitation,
this
actually.
This one right here?
Yep.
Oh, well, that's lovely.
So, and combine watercolor and lettering, and then it's printed.
And
I do a lot of the seating scrolls for weddings, which is the listing of where people are going to sit with the watercolors.
Yes, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, because I know there are so many applications that are still popular. I did want to ask a little bit about the history of calligraphy, which I think is so interesting. And first of all, what is calligraphy and what makes it different from ordinary handwriting or printing?
And perhaps there isn't a difference. You know, it's considered beautiful writing, and I think we've all known somebody that printed or wrote beautifully, all the way up to and beyond non-literal. But it starts with...
When she says non-literal, she means calligraphy that is just line for its own sake, not with content or literal
Right, just to enjoy the letter forms that might be all on top of each other, creating a unique set of negative and positive spaces. That's very, very interesting. Some people have difficulty recognizing that as calligraphy.
Yes.
But historically, our letters were mostly capitals.
Yes.
Going back.
Let's look at this wonderful chart she's made. This is tell us about this.
Well, of course, you can go way back to, you know, letters on caves and so forth, but early recognizable lettering starts with the Greek, through the Romans, getting into your Roman caps as in the Trajan columns.
So those were all capitals.
And they were all capitals with the limit of width. And then as the centuries went on, the half uncial. Uncial means inch, so those were an inch wide as an inch tall.
Wow.
And so the half uncials came along, and then we got into the various hands, the Carolingian hand from the age of Caroline, into the humanist hands and the Gothics. I mean, there are 50 Gothics. You know, I teach several of them, the German Fraktur or broken.
Yes, this would be the Gothic here. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is that the earlier ones were so broad that they took up too much space on the page. So the Gothic compressed down so they could put more. I mean, imagine trying to do the Bible.
And they mirrored particularly the architecture of each era.
Yes.
For instance, in the Celtic era, the rounded arches, but by the time your Gothics came, you had the Gothic arches.
Pointed arches.
Yep, yeah. So it was pointed, it just mirrored as it went along.
Sure.
And ending with the italic hand, and shortly, because each of these hands had variations all over.
Absolutely.
When the italic...
From culture to culture, but also from individual to individual.
Yes, but then with the printing press, it stopped. And so the italic hand somewhat froze, and that is what when people think of calligraphy, that is usually what they think of.
So Gutenberg set up the Gothic print as movable type.
Right.
And then you started to talk about typeface.
Right, uppercase and lowercase, because that's where you got your pieces from.
And that would have been like mid-15th century.
Yes, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
wonderful.
It's
you know, I also wanted to look at the instruments they were using and talk about the materials. Like in the Middle Ages, they were using the parchment, and a lot of people don't really understand what parchment is, but...
Right, I have several. I have some beautiful pieces. It's animal skin, and we are always assured that it is a waste product, that nobody dies to create it. One would hope so. But it is animal skin that's been cured, and it's just beautiful. It takes...
And that's one of the reasons why so many of these ancient manuscripts have survived.
Yes.
Because they were not paper.
Yes.
And they were not vulnerable to the elements as much, and they were very durable.
And that's why it's exciting that for the first time in 500 years, a Bible is being hand done with skins from Israel. The first page is the DNA of the House of David. It's gender non-specific, and it's from the monks at the St. John's Abbey in Minnesota. I was there when they announced it.
Isn't that something? I wonder how many years that will take.
Well, it's just about finished. That was 1990. And it's just about finished.
20 years.
A Welsh calligrapher, Donald Jackson, I always like to claim him as a relative, but he isn't, felt that he was born to do this task. They took a Lloyd's of London insurance policy on him, and he has...
So it's all in his one hand?
Well, he developed a particular hand. In fact, it was the Carolingian, little bit of a change off it, and he trained other people to do it.
Oh.
So it was his masterpiece, and there were artists from all over, some very contemporary and some, you know, more traditional.
And that is right in keeping with the tradition of the monks keeping the calligraphy and the, really writing.
Right.
Forget calligraphy, just
Yep.
education and literature and manuscripts. The monks were the ones who preserved all that during the 4th and 5th century, especially in Ireland.
And that's why the Celtic hand particularly really just prospered for 13 centuries. It was a long time. And so while there were lots of changes within it, it was the longest, and very insular because these people were cut off. So it developed and it stayed and it stayed.
Great book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. So it's a good about how, as the Dark Ages swept Europe, the Irish were busy doing their little books and their little monasteries, so they kept the knowledge alive. Let's take a look at some of your materials. I'm really anxious to see what you have here.
I have, these are typical materials that with a square nib, and a nib is the end that we write with.
And they can be made out of anything, right?
Right, from quills to MathScribes.
Meaning just a little piece of paper that's been beveled off.
Right, and just dunk it right in your paints and right away. And all sorts of large pens. I'm particularly fond of the Coits and the automatics.
What does Coits mean?
It's just their brand.
Oh.
It's a steel pen for
Show
larger.
us a mark of those pens, just for fun.
And it just really makes a nice mark. Oops.
Now you're using ink in that bucket, or?
I am. This is a Sumi ink, which is a carbon-based. It has.
So it's a ground carbon.
Who knows? There's all sorts of stories about what might go in your ink. You know, some stories. Supposedly, one year there was a snake remains because it has natural elements that help it adhere to the paper.
A chicken tooth was present.
There you go. Well, and then of course, as calligraphers, we're great for putting pens in our mouth, which we should not. So some people don't do that anymore. But it is a beautiful pen.
Well, especially with all the cadmium paints they were using.
Oh, yeah.
And leads and so forth.
So when we're using...
So obviously the straight nip pen gives you the thick thin.
Right. Without
changing pressure.
Yes, but as you go down, with my students at the museum, I'll use a speedball pen that's fairly stiff. But as we go along, the Mitchell pens, you know, will get a bit of a thick and a thin with
just by pressure of your hand.
Yep.
Yes.
Which is called entasis. When you have, for instance, say a short I or a capital I, that you would have like a pressure, release, pressure, so that it'd be a wasting in the middle.
And it's the same thing with every brush stroke, really. You know, the artist is so conscious of the stroke that he makes with the brush, or, how fast the stroke is, how loaded the brush stroke is, how the stroke begins, how it lifts off.
And how you might choose to not have it be, for instance, to have a little dry brush effect and go back in with
that gives
colored.
It a very, that little drag on the end of the stroke can give it a very spontaneous, handmade look. And you know, that's one of the things I really love about calligraphy is the idea that you know, like if we said, well, what's the difference between a printed computer type that looks like calligraphy and calligraphy? The difference is very great because in the hand-done thing, you see all those subtle little variations where the artist has, the ink has run out just a little bit, and then they reload the pen so it gets a little bit darker, or the pressure is just a little tiny bit wider.
A lot of the human touch is very visible.
So it takes away that mechanical fakeness of the,
And all your color work is done with paint. And now I know that they can press a button on a computer and make your writing red and so forth, but the nuances, the changing of color,
Yes.
Anything that I do, I have not had a problem with the computer replicating it, and which is a good
The
thing.
computer replicates it, but it's not like creating it on the computer where it has a certain mechanical look that is perfection.
Right.
It's like looking at those, you know, the patterns of chaos. You know, they're tremendously interesting, but they're not about art because they're not really, they don't have the individual touch,
the
expression,
spontaneity, and
the nuance thing. It's machined, it's perfection, and then you look at it and you've seen it.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
it doesn't have all that nuance to
That
it.
is correct.
So anyway, that's an interesting thing. Hey, I wanted to ask you too. You have won a lot of competitions.
I have. It's been very, very interesting. The one that I've won the most frequently is called the Graceful Envelope, and it was started by the Smithsonian. So my first 6 winnings there are part of the Smithsonian collection. I didn't know that. I didn't know
That's
I
awesome.
wasn't getting it back, the first one. But then when I found out where it was, I didn't mind.
You didn't mind.
In fact, one of mine that didn't win because I didn't follow directions, I made it an inch too big. They liked it the best, so they still have it in the collection. But the national letter carriers took over the competition. And so I've just had my 13th win. I said, gee, it must be lucky 13.
You're nationally known.
And
I can see that.
It's exciting because my dad was a letter carrier. And
What a nice
so it's
connection.
a nice connection.
Very,
Absolutely.
very, very nice. So do you have any examples of the Graceful Envelope there that I know you
It's in the book.
have done many of those? I suppose they're in this book.
Yeah,
we'll show one of those.
We'll show them.
Here's another thing I thought I'd show, though, another one of these books, which has a beautiful handmade, you made this paper yourself?
Yep.
And so it's just tremendously physical and textural. And then the book opens out and you can see these gorgeous letters. And notice the variations in the value of the ink. Like some places it's a little darker, some place the ink deposits a little more, sometimes the ink is a little thinner. And the words there,
The texture between the two is very important.
It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a fun one.
I love this piece.
And that was done with one of these alternative pens that people...
Tell us more about the pens then.
Some of the pens, you know, first of all, we do beautiful script with a beautiful pen, which I had in my pile, and I must have taken it out of my pile. But a fun pen that people use nowadays, and of course brushes, but is the old ruling pen that years ago you would just dip in ink and use it to make lines.
Look at the thinness of that line. It's amazing.
And this is a pen, a ruling pen. This is a very expensive ruling pen that I had for a class with Gottfried Pott. But this is a beer can pen, which is great fun.
Which you made yourself.
Well, actually, I've made quite a few of them, but one of my students made 2 for everybody in the class last year. And it has to be...
I'm going to make that with my grandchildren.
And it has to be a beer can because it is a thicker metal.
But
so
very bendable and cuttable.
Right, and with the beer can pen, you can make little letters, or you can come down further and make...
Isn't that gorgeous?
You know, wonderful
Yeah.
letters. This is a piece, I'm in a study group with a group of women, and I always have to look at which, and what this says, which you'd never know, says, reveal the spirit you have about the thing, which is a quote. We had to invent our own alphabet using a ruling pen.
Wow.
Your own ABCD, and then do a piece in it.
So why is this called a ruling pen? I thought ruling pens you had to put the little drop in.
This is a real ruling pen,
Yeah.
an actual one, and and people still use them, and they covet the old ones that
I
people
have
did with the long and the various things. and
Actually,
that's-
my husband Lou had one from engineering studies of some kind. And I
Exactly.
have one of also. But the cool thing about it is it was mechanical, so you could adjust the thickness
Exactly.
of how much ink was coming out.
Yeah, so your line would be thicker or thinner as you wish.
So it was like a mechanical pen.
Right. Yes.
Of
But
course, this was before the days of felt nib
Yes.
markers and stuff like that.
And this came along as fellows, and I believe it started in Europe when they began taking these ruling pens and using them on their side to letter, and then they so you really were lettering with that side.
No kidding.
So they shortened, and
Yeah.
several famous calligraphers, they all have developed a different nib like this. This one is called the butterfly, and it works the same way.
So you don't have to load that with a dropper.
No.
Because
no.
we always had to load it with a dropper and just put it so that
To
the
make
ink
sure.
it was
Yeah.
like capillary action that kept the ink from spilling.
And what, what we do is that you do, a recognizable alphabet. For instance, that might be in italic, and it's fun to maybe do, what would be considered a Celtic.
And what makes Celtic Celtic?
What makes Celtic Celtic is its proportions. Maybe a good segue. In that, if we're working with a continuous nib, no matter what we do, we get
And let's just tell the audience, when we talk about, having felt nib markers, years ago, there was no such thing as being able to make a line that went in any direction. There was no such instrument that could do that, except...
That's hard for people to believe.
No, they can't understand that. I still remember a drawing teacher I had who was talking about the rapidograph, and it was such an invention because you could draw backwards.
Yeah.
And you could go up and down and sideways in every direction.
And not blot when you're using a ruler.
A circle.
Yeah.
Try making a circle with a brush. It's not you have
easy.
to do
Exactly. But if we make the same mark with a broad pen, we really don't have anything. So we have certain rules.
Yeah.
And so with the Celtic hand, for instance, we would make it anywhere from 2 to 3 nibs high.
So, okay, good measurement.
Say we were to make an O, we really have to reach way the heck out there to make it an oval.
Yes.
Yes. But
in that height.
To get that going, to get that proportion. But if we were to make a Gothic at 4 or 5 nibs high, in changing the angle, then we get a very different.
Awesome.
So it's
that's a wonderful
rule.
example. That's a wonderful example. So the Gothic, you can see, is so much more compressed.
Absolutely.
Much more compressed.
And you could see that
we have so much to talk about.
Historically, people liked you to teach and begin learning with the Celtic.
Yes.
And invariably, the students would be, oh my goodness,
That's when I learned. It was so wide.
When can I use it,
Hey, how do they keep the line straight?
When you're, first of all, a lot of times like even that book that you opened, I don't rule, but a lot of things require ruling, or even a part of it. I love to balance, even on that piece that's there, balance my lettering in a very precise way with some part that's not precise. And we literally rule with pencil.
So you draw the lines. What about light boxes? Are they ever?
And then you go back and erase. When we're lettering with watercolor, we have to be careful to add a little bit of gum arabic to the paint so that when we go to erase our lines, we don't erase our paint. But with the Sumi ink that I use, that's not an issue. But we use pencil.
So the gum arabic keeps you from lifting the watercolor
off the paper when you're removing your lines.
It's still reversible though with gum arabic. It's not like acrylic.
Right. You wouldn't want to make, you wouldn't want to have to change anything.
Yeah, you couldn't really. And this has some very delicate little uses of watercolor in it. Beautiful combination. So you really do the watercolor, is that done first or second?
Well,
or?
excellent question. The lettering, interestingly, is usually done with the gouache, with the opaque, but any decorative watercolor
gouache
pieces,
being the opaque watercolor.
and then any decorative pieces would be done in the more transparent regular watercolor. Usually, ideally, we would do the lettering and then enhance it with, bring it to life. The ancients felt by putting
With illumination.
with the illumination, you brought the thought
and it was
to
a
life.
decorative thing.
That's right.
Yeah. Geez, there's so many more I would like to show. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what kinds of things you do now, and what is your, what are most of your commissions, for example?
Well, I have a certain number of corporate commissions. I do awards for Boston Scientific, for instance, when they have people retiring, very beautifully written accolades of their years in service. Lots of awards and recognitions, people for, different jobs. I've done a lot here in Worcester for different people that have done things. And I do a lot of poems for people.
And you can give those as gifts, which is very nice.
Lot. Yes, I do notes.
A framed calligraphy gift is a lovely thing.
Do a lot of baby names, baby announcements.
Wedding announcements.
Yep. Yep.
And all of those things are wonderful.
Yep, keep me busy.
And so people can get in touch with you if they wanted to see more of your work.
That's right.
At your email, which is?
Which is gjkerdok, Kerdok, @gmail.com. And,
you could take a look at some of her work and maybe think about that as a unique gift.
Yep.
Well, it's a wonderful art form, and when I think about line as being one of the most expressive things in the vocabulary of art, visual art, and how it carries the emotion of the artist, and I'm just thrilled with the medium and loving the idea that it continues in this day and age and is appreciated for its aesthetic. Boy, I wish we had more time. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. But thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And,
my pleasure.
I really appreciate your time. And we'll hope to see you again next time for another edition of Arts and Ideas.